So I'm really excited to welcome our next guest, the absolutely fantastic Dr. Stacy Hope. Stacy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. And thank you, Dr. Sarah Gordon, for having me. So my name is Stacy Hope. I am, on the one hand, Managing Director for Women in Mining UK, but I work mostly with the multilaterals, so mostly the UN Group and the World Bank, around issues pertaining to gender, climate risk, and disaster risk management, and put that all together, looking at various sectors, especially the mining sector within Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as Sub-Saharan Africa. So very briefly what I do, but I also translate all of that into understanding how we can invest responsibly in social impact investment projects.
Brilliant.
So
that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Stacey, for that. So given this wealth of expertise and experience, when somebody says to you the just transition, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm an anthropologist, right? So everything starts from, and I'm a social anthropologist. So it all starts from people and communities. And the just transition for me, and I think in general, really pertains to how do we translate an energy transition that resonates with people. So how do we ensure that livelihoods are secured and guaranteed, and how do we bring them into the fore of this energy transition discourse? So, you know, a lot of people, and I'm right now in South Africa, a major coal jurisdiction. I work quite a lot across various sectors, and usually it's not coal, but coal for me, it's quite interesting because coal exists quite a lot in jurisdictions that are heavily dependent on energy, but the majority of the population do not have access to energy. And right, so coal is that energy source that is a bit more accessible in jurisdictions like South Africa, like India. And in order to drive the energy transition, coal still has to exist to support it. And the workforce around that, the communities around that need to be a part of that conversation. So the just transition, it's really about how do we have these, what seems desperate, or not desperate, disparate conversations, bringing that together so that everyone is a part of the discourse. So, yeah.
So do you think then with that, do you think there are some parts of the world that have more to gain or to lose with the whole transition and the just transition?
More to gain or to lose? I've never actually thought of it as more to gain or to lose. I think the just transition at baseline means one thing, but within the various contexts, it develops in different ways and in different time frames. Yeah. So you have, on the one hand, a lot of people talking about phasing out certain energy sources, whereas it might be more about phasing down in order to give space to the development of renewable energy and over a different period of time. So maybe that's how I would look at it, as opposed to one over the other, because we all agree that we have to do something about climate change and the risks that it poses. And I work a lot at the forefront of climate risks. So I see what manifests because of it. But yeah, for me, I think that's really key, understanding the various contexts in which we have these conversations.
So just then zooming in on South Africa, because that's where you happen to be right this second. And as you mentioned, so South Africa predominantly draws its energy currently from coal. So as South Africa transitions away from coal into more of those renewable forms of power generation, what do you think is in it for the population in South Africa? Where are the opportunities for them?
Are we talking about opportunities in the renewable energy space, or as we transition towards?
I guess a bit of both.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. So I think there are many different ways in which we translate what it means to be in the coal sector towards a more renewable energy discourse, but this all still requires mining, right? And it's now about reconfiguring the workforce into meeting that just transition and the needs that the just transition will require. So there's a lot of education involved, a lot of understanding how do we translate certain capacities that exist, and how we develop those that don't. What are the gaps, and understanding how do we bring the same workforce and those outside of the current workforce into this new energy space.
Yeah. And so with that, Stacey, just one more question perhaps before we then dive properly into the world of mining. With regards to, say, so COP26, etc., quite a lot of the discussion was around, I guess, compensation to those parts of the world that are being negatively impacted by changing climate, perhaps faster than other parts of the world, such as small island states, etc. Do you have any comments with regards to that particular discussion?
So I'm from Guyana, and the Guyana government has or had engaged quite heavily in a low carbon development strategy, which involved the Norwegian government. And that was the Norwegian government paying the Guyanese government to maintain its vast rainforest. That's still maintained, it is still maintained, but mining also increased, right? And that actually wasn't seen as the Guyanese government not, I don't want to say cooperating, but maintaining its level of agreement with the Norwegians. It was looking at how do we then compensate for the fact that now we have intensified mining and we need to meet certain carbon capturing levels, right? Carbon sequestering levels. So I think they're outside of the small island states and the small states like Guyana and like the Caribbean islands, for example, in jurisdictions like Cape Town, like South Africa or various African countries, it's really about how do we then encourage governments to manage the environment, but how do we then negotiate between the emissions that mining companies emit? How do we ensure that investments to climate risk mitigation technologies are embedded into new and existing mining companies and mining operations? And then how do we onboard the communities as well to advocate, to understand, and then to really drive that narrative across these various jurisdictions?
So I guess, it's something there, it requires a huge amount of change, doesn't it? And that's the transition part of all of this. I guess part of the big challenge for us right now is how quickly can we enact that change? And the fact that we need to do this, the IPCC report said, okay, we need to reduce our global emissions by 40% by 2030. So we've got 7.5 years to reduce global emissions by 40%. This is big change. Do you think that, being a social anthropologist, do you think that communities around the world are going to be able to do this? And I say this being part of a community myself, of course.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because there are various types of communities, and we're all at different levels, or I don't want to say levels, but at different parts of this conversation. I work mostly with Indigenous communities who are probably one of the major conservationists in the world, right? And then I also work with artisanal miners. who use mercury. So, so there's yeah, it becomes quite discombobulating trying to navigate the various communities. And within this 7.5 years time frame, that might shift quite soon, right? But that shouldn't negate from the fact that we still need to onboard everyone. We still need to engage, and not engage from a Western language, but really understanding and engaging with institutions, organizations that are already on the ground, who are communicating, who are able to engage local communities, regardless of their focus. I work a lot with women in mining groups, like there's Guyana Women in Mining, and they work around climate change, mercury abatement, gender-based violence. And if you want anyone to get Indigenous communities and mining communities on board, you reach out to them. You don't reach out to government institutions, because they build their base in the communities. Mm-hmm. So when we're trying to engage and to bring communities on board, look at local institutions that are already doing that and see how we can utilize them to really drive that narrative and drive that change. It's not about bringing the international consultants like myself to talk to people. It's about bringing us on board to help give local organizations the tools in which to do that themselves. So that's where we'll see a bit more like a faster drive towards everyone engaging and participating, but everyone moves at different paces. So it's really understanding the contextual environment in which everyone exists, and being a bit more realistic.
Yeah. So with that then, Stacey, I guess what I'm hearing there, it's think about where you can almost have that indirect impact and actually support those groups who perhaps have a bit more credibility, a bit more understanding with regards to what's really needed in that particular jurisdiction, in that particular part of the world, rather than coming in with a sledgehammer and saying, you will do this.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think a lot of the mining sector understands that. Mm-hmm. We still have a lot of work to do, but I have found that quite a number of mining companies understand that if you want to operate, if you want to maintain that social license, and if you want the communities to support what you're doing, you have to speak that language. It's not the armchair anthropologist. I'm not an armchair anthropologist, but it's not, it's not the chairman sitting at headquarters driving that narrative. It's the local workforce. It's the local organizations. And I see the mining sector really working hard, but it really is trying to embed that into your operations and get it going that way.
So I know that you've already mentioned mining many times during this conversation so far, but let's zoom straight in onto the mining say and say, okay, so we've got the just transition, which is moving already. Perhaps it needs to accelerate in some areas, but it is difficult to make this happen. What is mining's role within that just transition?
Yeah. Oof. And I'd say, what are the roles, right? Yeah. So I think, I mentioned mining's positioning in communities already to some degree. But for me, this is quite a heavy topic, because on the one hand, we need more mining in order to meet energy transition goals and targets. Mm-hmm. There is also the conversation about recycling of metals, but at the same time, that alone cannot make the energy transition successful. So there needs to be more mining, and the mining sector needs to understand its place within the wider discourse of climate in climate risk. So it's not just about providing more materials, it's also about providing more materials in a way that's sustainable, that's responsible, that's addressing the climate issues and climate risks, and looking towards investing in technologies and being a part of something that's a bit more outside of the box. Not to mention oil and gas, but if we were to compare oil and gas with mining, oil and gas is way ahead when it comes to technological advancement. The mining sector really needs to look at how can technology not only drive its business, but also drive the discourse around climate and the just transition. And it's not about replacing people with tech as well. Because oftentimes when I mention technology and innovation, a lot of people are like, but what about the people? It's also about looking at how the people on the ground can be a part of this technological advancement, whether it's just to name drop, looking at Anglo American recently announcing their hydrogen fueled mine haul trucks, which is great because we're looking at ways to really bring technology to the fore. It's not about replacing people from driving trucks, it's about bringing people on board to come up with innovative technologies, but then also bringing that workforce back and engaging them in this new conversation around the types of technology and types of things that we're doing within the sector. So the mining sector has its place in the sense that it is contributing from a materiality side, but it's also contributing from a change in the narrative of how mining is done.
So what you've got there, I guess, is you've got that, exactly as you've mentioned, so the change with regards to the volume of the material and the diversity, I guess, of the material that needs to be provided into the market, how it is actually mined. So where can we utilize more innovative technology to be able to help us do it in a more perhaps climate and sustainability sensitive manner? What do you think the impact is going to be on people around the world? So if we've got a big ramping up in terms of the sheer activity that's needed in mining, how do we anticipate that's going to impact on people in those mining areas, or where there are those minerals and metals that we need? Yeah,
because it could go one of two ways if we're not careful, or it could go one and two ways. I don't know how to frame it, depending on where you are. Because we could easily fall down the rabbit hole of wanting to meet the needs of one agenda and forgetting about the other, right? So it could be, look, this is climate resilient. This is where there's lots of carbon sequestering happening here. We're doing our best from the climate side, but then we could easily fall to the wayside from the social side. And we have seen it in the past, right? And not even in the past, but we are seeing it a little bit because mining companies are really trying to grasp the needs that climate change requires of them. So in the studying of climate change, there's also like a putting to the back burner. Is that the same, putting in the back burner? The social side and the communities, and we must not lose that. We have to continue to engage. So there's that. But then we could also have that scenario, that beautiful scenario where we are climate resilient, we do have our social engagement, and we're just bringing everyone to the fore. I feel like I haven't answered your question, and maybe you can rephrase it, and then I can re-answer it.
Yeah, sure. So I think it's a case of with the need to increase our mining activity, so therefore the potential increased impact on communities. Are there any hints or tips perhaps with regards to how do we make this more right rather than more wrong with regards to that increase in activity?
Yes. So one thing you can do is support the industry around mining. So how do we build communities that also respond to the mining sector with more agility, and with, I guess, here what I always think of are the social entrepreneurs that can arise, that entrepreneurial community that can arise out of mining. We don't see it quite a lot or enough. And I feel that we're missing a trick here, right? How do we empower communities to have industry of their own, but then also to respond to the needs of the mining sector? And we don't, I think that's also in part because mining companies still need to understand what their needs are and how best to work with governments, because sometimes it's very difficult, and how to bring communities into this multi-stakeholder discussion to come up with something that can work. And I always think that entrepreneurship, communities being able to feed into the mining sector, but then also feed into other sectors beyond the mining activities, because obviously there's a life of mines. We don't want people to be hooked on one thing. We want them to be able to also diversify. But how can we ensure that communities are not just a part of mining, but a part of a wider discourse within their nation state? And I think that's probably one of the major things I always tell clients, like, okay, great, you're doing all of this community work, lovely. Yes, you set up farms and you buy from them, but what happens afterwards, right? And what are the future proofing plans for your company that you can anticipate communities can participate in as well? So it's also that anticipation as to what will be needed from the business and what we can ask of those communities. That's one of the things in terms of the ramping up. But I also fear that with the ramping up, and especially with climate change and mining companies really trying to understand what that entails, we will start leaving communities out of that conversation as a way to just try and wrap our heads around this very complex concept.
Is that because engaging communities takes time, and so therefore we feel we don't have time to do that proper engagement, given that we want to get the graphite or whatever it might be out of the ground as fast as possible to meet the demand?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of that, but I also think that it's not purposefully done, but I do think that we do have a tendency, whether you're in mining, whether you're in agriculture, when you want to really grasp a very challenging and complex idea, concept, like climate change, that you want to get it right? So you're looking at technologies coming out of Scandinavia, or you're looking at the Chinese or whoever, the Japanese for the technology. So you're looking at all of these more robust and other organizations, countries, jurisdictions, in your quest to really understand and come up with technological advancement. But at the same time, you're not bringing the communities along in that journey because you don't think that it's the right time. We'll bring them along at another time, at a later date. And that's not what we do. That's not what you should do. It should always be from inception to completion. And that's, for me, the most sustainable way for driving any business where you work with and around communities. But then also, it's just good business. The risk exposure that you have from not bringing people on from the inception, it's just greater. So yeah, it makes sense, everyone. Let's bring everyone along from the beginning.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stacy. So just in closing, any final words of wisdom for us or any messages you'd like us to push out there? So
many messages, but I think along all of this, we have to ensure that we bring everyone along on the journey. So it's not just the chiefs of the communities, it's the young people who are looking for work, who feel disempowered because they aren't being involved in a lot of the conversations. It's the women who are often kept away by communities, depending on the communities, from that conversation as well. So it's up to mining companies or oil and gas, coal power, energy companies to say to communities, we need to have these people, we need to have women, we need to have men, we need to have young people, and these are the people that need to participate. Once you do that, then communities are obliged, and that way you have that diversity of thought and diversity in problem solving, in coming up with ways to really ensure that a just transition is a just transition. So it's not, when we say communities, the chiefs, because you say the community, the chief is the representative, but the chief is also a representative of himself or herself and her ideals. That does not translate to everyone. So I'd say that. And I don't want to make any shameless plugs, but speaking about women, I always encourage mining companies to support their women in mining organizations. There are so many around the world, and that also will help mining companies to translate the gendered aspect of what it is that they're doing. So that's it for me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Stacy.